Welcome to your friendly neighborhood historian, where we discuss just enough history to inform, intrigue, and entertain. I'm Bill Petro. The history of Easter and the Sanhedrin. Who was this council? The Greek word Sanhedrin means literally sitting together and is usually translated as council. It is referred to in the New Testament alternatively as the Great Law Court, the Court of 71, and the rulers and elders and scribes. It was the supreme theocratic court of the Jews. The Sanhedrin reflected the local autonomy that first the Greek and later the Roman powers granted the Jewish nation during their successive sovereignty over the land of Israel. Its origin can be traced back as far as 200 BC, during the intertestamental period, which extends about 400 years after the close of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament writings. We hear about it during the Hasmonean period, following the Maccabean Revolt, which you can hear about in my History of Hanukkah podcast. There are references to it in the Mishnah section of the Talmud, but there is no reference to this body in the original Old Testament. The council had about 70 members plus the ruling high priest. 3 professional groups composed the council. The high priests, which included the acting high priest, former high priests, and members of the chief priestly families. The elders, who were tribal and family heads of the people and the priesthood, and scribes, which were the legal professionals. At the time of Jesus, there were 2 religio-political parties within Judaism that were represented in the Sanhedrin. The Sadducees were the majority party, and the Pharisees were the minority. Caiaphas, the high priest, was a Sadducee, but most of the scribes were Pharisees. The presiding officer of the Sanhedrin was usually the high priest. The council was connected with the minor courts, itself being the highest court of appeal from these. The Sanhedrin's authority was broad and far-reaching, involving legislation, administration, and justice. There was religious, civil, and criminal jurisdiction. But it had its limitations. During Jesus' time, the council had lost the power of capital punishment, called in Latin jus gladii, to the Roman governor. The council met daily, except on the Sabbath and feast days, in a session room adjoining the temple. In extraordinary cases, the council met at the high priest's house. One of the Sanhedrin's responsibilities was identifying and confirming the arrival of the Messiah. The Gospel writers identify a delegation from the council going out to the Jordan River to ask John the Baptist about whether he himself was the Messiah. About a dozen false messiahs were running around during the first part of this century, deceiving the people. It was the council's responsibility to identify and denounce them. This is why Jesus had to come into contact with them at some point in his ministry. Who were the Pharisees? Although the Pharisees were the minority party within the council, they were the majority party outside the council. The Jewish writer and philosopher Philo tells us they numbered 6,000 across the Roman world during the first century. They were highly respected amongst the people, operating principally in the synagogues. The typical Jewish boy would have received his religious training from a Pharisee. Their name meant separated ones, and they kept themselves pure from any corrupting influence, including Greek or Roman cultural ones, which were considered pagan. They first appeared more than a century before Jesus, though they had little interest in politics by that time. They had a highly developed system of rabbinic tradition that sought to apply the biblical law to various circumstances. They held to 3 doctrines that the Sadducees did not: the immortality of the soul, the resurrection of the body, and the existence of angels and demons. These they had in common with Jesus. These men were devout laymen, not priests. Where they conflicted with Jesus was the charge that in their over-attention to the tradition of men concerning the minutiae of the law, they had essentially neglected the real intention of the law. Numbered among the Pharisees were some names you might know: Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, the great teacher Gamaliel, and his student Saul of Tarsus, later known as St. Paul. Who were the Sadducees? The Sadducees seem to have gotten their name from the Hebrew word Zadikim, which means the righteous one. They had little in common with the Pharisees except for their antagonism toward Jesus. The Sadducees represented the Jewish aristocracy and the high priesthood. They had made their peace with Roman political rulers and attained positions of wealth and influence. Temple administration and ritual were their specific responsibilities. Being well educated and wealthy, they held themselves aloof from the masses, and they were unpopular with them. They were externally religious and highly political, seeing Jesus as a threat to the existing state of affairs. Unlike the Pharisees, the Sadducees held only to the written law, specifically the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah. Who was the high priest? The New Testament calls 2 men high priest, Annas and the previously mentioned Caiaphas. It turns out that Caiaphas was actually the current high priest at this time, though there are several reasons why Annas was called the high priest. He was Caiaphas' father-in-law, and he had been high priest from AD 6 through 15, at which time he was deposed by the Roman governor preceding Pontius Pilate, who was named Valerius Gratus, shortly after the governor took office. The governor tried 3 more high priests within the next 3 years, until he appointed Caiaphas, a man he found cooperative, in AD 18. Nevertheless, Annas was the patriarch and the real power behind the high priesthood. While the title was used later for Annas as an honorific, the Jews still saw the high priesthood as an office for life, regardless of whether the Romans felt that way. He was the senior ex-high priest and may have sometimes presided over the council. This is why Jesus was first brought to Annas during his trial on Good Friday. Thank you for listening. I'm Bill Petro, your friendly neighborhood historian. You can find more details on this topic and others on my website at billpetro.com.